Yeah, thank you so much for the warm welcome, and thanks all of you for being here. I mean, the sun is shining outside. I saw many people sitting on benches, eating ice cream, enjoying the short summer in Sweden, and you are all here listening to my talk about maybe sometimes a little bit depressing issues such as Earth system transformation, climate change. But I want to take you on a journey and combining these two visualizations of our planet. On the one hand, the planet as it is, an integrated, interdependent, socio-ecological system at planetary scale, our home, the Earth. And here you see the planet, how our politicians understand it, as a planet divided by 190 countries with capitals and armies and geopolitical conflicts and all kind of other stuff, but not necessarily as an integrated system and not with very strong intergovernmental institutions that can run the planet. And I want to take you on a journey to bring it all together in a way. I will mention climate change from time to time. I will mention democracy from time to time. I'll also mention, I have a few slides about Donald Trump. I mean, you can't have a talk these days without bringing Donald into the picture. That's what I want to do. I start with the planet. And here I like to start with a quote that Wendy knows by heart, I'm very sure, from the Amsterdam Declaration from the International Geosphere-Biosphere Program. That used to be a large research program where all the natural scientists work together. The predecessor of Future Earth, it is now based here. It was already based in Stockholm at that time. And all these scientists came together 24 years ago in Amsterdam, and they concluded that our home, our Earth, our planet, is outside a state that it has for 500,000 years. Now we might want to talk about 800,000 years, and that human activities could trigger severe consequences for the Earth's environment and could potentially switch the Earth system, our home, into alternative modes of operation that might be irreversible and inhospitable for humans and for non-humans as well. And this was 24 years ago, and I can say it also personally, that was when I was a postdoc actually at that time. And so I was really making my career, and then I was a political scientist working on international relations, trying to find a way forward in my life, academically, privately anyway. And then I saw this, I mean, of course, a bit more than just this one quote in a sense. And then I said, what does it mean for political science? What does it mean for politics? What does it mean for international relations? And then I started to think about Earth system governance, and now I'm ending up in giving a talk on this topic here. Just again, also for the planetary crisis, I mean, climate change is a topic, and I'm really excited that this institute is picking up climate and democracy. I think it's very important, but also I think it's very important to see climate change in connection to the rest of sustainability. It's not only climate change, it's a sustainability crisis. So if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations, then we find, I mean, they have 17 goals, 169 targets, that only 17% of those targets are on track to be met by 2030 when they're supposed to be met. 1/3 of these targets are actually falling backwards, partially because of Corona, admittedly, but partially also just by silly, ineffective, insufficient policies from our governments at the local, national, and global scale. For example, 700 million people woke up this morning in extreme poverty. 10%, every 10th person lives still in extreme poverty, and the numbers might even be increasing if we continue like that. And that is also part of the crisis. It's also a crisis, also very important for any program on climate to think climate as a problem of inequality, a problem of injustice, which is already mentioned by the director this morning, just right now. But I think it's very important to never forget it. That's why I always have these kind of slides, that this is 10% of the human population, the richest ones, the rich ones in the north, and the richest ones in the global south. Only these 10% are causing 50% of the carbon dioxide emissions. And if you look at this graph from Oxfam, which I really like, because it also suggests the solution by the graph, but also by the color code. You can see there's red. Red is danger, red is stupidity, red is, in this case, overconsumption. So this is what climate is. And that means also when you talk about climate change and democracy here at this institute and other things, this slide must be always one in the beginning. Never forget that this is kind of a problem of inequality and injustice. I looked for the last 30 years at international relations, and there so much has been done in this field. We have 1,300 international agreements on the environment in a way. We have lots of public-private partnerships. We have lots of UN reforms. We have a United Nations Environment Assembly. We have a high-level political forum on sustainable development. So many things have been conceived and implemented, but overall, nothing really has worked so far. The latest from the UN system have been the Sustainable Development Goals that I mentioned already. That is kind of the biggest, newest hype, in a sense, from the UN system, where the UN has agreed in 2015 on 17 goals with 169 targets. There's a huge amount of enthusiasm at that time. Claims have been made, some of them I put out there, that governments are resolved to free the human race from the tyranny of poverty and want and to heal and secure our planet. I mean, this is what our governments have kind of put in on a text in 2015. So there was a lot of claim. And I'm a political scientist, so I was very interested around that time. I want to know, does it actually have any impact that you have the United Nations General Assembly coming up with these 70 goals, with these big claims? Will it change anything? And for that purpose, we got a research program, so we applied for some funding, and we got a research program from the European Research Council to study the political impacts of these Sustainable Development Goals. We had our own team, we had PhD students and postdocs and people working on these issues. We also conducted a meta-analysis where we looked with 60 colleagues together at 3,000 scientific studies about the SDGs and their political impact. So we really did quite a thorough analysis in a way, and we couldn't find much. I mean, we couldn't find a lot of substantial impact, political steering effects of these SDGs at the local level, at the national level, at the global level. It is a bit more nuanced, of course. You find some changes in cities, for example, progressive cities such as Utrecht, where I'm based. So these cities, there is where lots of students and progressive people are connected. There you find also quite a lot of change, but not in the larger scheme. We couldn't find a lot of changes in terms of realignment of institutions, changes in laws, changes in regulations, changes in funding. We couldn't find a lot. So in a way, here my conclusion is, after 6 years of research with our team, that this was actually not the most effective approach so far. So the conclusion on that part is, in a way, the governance is failing. It is a problem of governance. And here I would probably get into a discussion with Wendy, because I believe that natural science, we know actually a lot. We know a lot about climate, biodiversity, oceans, etc. I don't want to discourage people to do research on oceans and climate, etc. But I think what we don't understand is how we can really improve governance. Institutions, politics, I think that is a shortcoming. And here we really need to have a better understanding and also, of course, more action. And that is what we try to do in this Earth System Governance project that was already mentioned, in community of researchers trying to better understand governance, institutions, and politics in a policy-oriented, policy-driven manner. And that means also, coming to the terminology to some extent, that we believe that the old term of environmental policy is failing. I mean, that is kind of 1970s. We have to try to develop new concepts of how can we really understand. If you remember my opening slide, these two balls, how can we really understand politics at a planetary scale? And that means, this is the reason why we came up with this new kind of program. We don't call it an environmental policy program, we call it the Earth System Governance Program. Other people use other terms. There are also people who say planetary governance or planetary politics or Earth governance or Anthropocene governance. I mean, so many different terms are kind of popping up in the community, and they're all meaning more or less the same thing, that we have to change our understanding of politics at planetary scale. Breaking down these old dichotomies of there's a person, the people, and the environment around the people. No, we are an integrated system. We are all part of a social-ecological system at the local scale here in Sweden, but also at the planetary scale. That is what the planet is. We have to break it down. Maybe we can discuss it later in the Q&A session. We have to also go beyond the nation-state system, because we have to focus on planetary boundaries much more than on national boundaries and these matters. We have to also think about the long term. I mean, we are talking, when Wendy talks later, of the natural science findings, planetary boundaries. These are long-term issues. I mean, Greenland meltdown, Arctic meltdown, and this will take centuries, maybe to some extent. And most of these impacts will happen when, frankly, some of us will not be there in a sense. So, but that requires politics that can deal with these long terms. We need to have institutions that can deal with these long-term issues. And I understood that the Climate and Democracy program here at IDEA is focusing on these issues. And I think it's a fantastic development. I really congratulate you on looking more on these. How can you bring the long-term into national or local or global decision-making? I think it's fundamentally important. And of course, bringing in justice and democracy. I mean, these are very important things. How can you understand justice at planetary scale, planetary justice, Earth system justice? These are all kind of important concepts that are not sufficiently understood and where we need to have really more social scientists working on these issues. And that's what we do in what was mentioned, the Earth System Governance Project, or we call it sometimes the Earth System Governance Research Alliance. It is a community of researchers which is global, from all countries, pluralistic in the sense that we do not have any theories per se. It's not one theory, it's not one model. It's pluralistic. Everybody can join with different, I mean, that's what social science is about. I mean, you have different theories, you have different approaches. It's interdisciplinary, of course, and it is also engaged. I think most of our community, it's an academic community, so people are writing books and papers, etc., and getting PhDs, but it is also engaged scholarship. People really want to change the world. I think that's one important thing. If you go to these conferences, there's so much energy of young people who really want to be a change agent, in a sense, by academic research, trying to develop ideas, trying to move forward, and that is what Earth System Governance is about. It is a network, I mentioned, with 600 researchers. We have annual conferences for the last 20 years, working on this future Earth, of course, 19 task forces. We have a book series with MIT Press, we have a book series with Cambridge University Press, we have our own journal, and very important, that's why I mentioned, I see so many enthusiastic young people here, it's always open for new collaborations. It's an open network, so we really would like to work with more people. So if you find this kind of interesting, it fits to your agenda in a sense, just join. Send an email to me or to the International Project Office and become a research fellow or become a collaborator from an institutional perspective. You're very welcome. We have a science plan. This little one is the first science plan with terms that I was still responsible for. This is the actual science plan from the current generation of leaders of this project. It was announced in the main cathedral of Utrecht. It was maybe a little bit too much to announce in the cathedral, but it was kind of available. But I just point this out because I have to, with the mic, because democracy is very, very important. I mean, this democracy and power, these are the research lenses of the project. And democracy and power and architecture, these are important points. There are quite a few people looking at issues of democracy in this community. You're very welcome to join. That was the first part. And normally, in my normal presentation, if you would have invited me 1 year ago, I would have continued with all kind of reform ideas about UN and what to do better. But I can't do it anymore because the world has to some extent changed. I think it's very useful also to have, as you mentioned it already, to have also discussion before we have all kind of fantastic proposals, to have a very frank discussion. Is anything of this actually feasible with Donald J. Trump? Being in the White House and being very active. I mean, signing one executive order after the other. I mean, right this morning I read in the news that he asked now the British government, I mean, to stop with windmills and get more oil exploration in the UK. I mean, it's a bit bizarre in a sense. But I mean, we all read the news. I mean, they got out of the Paris Agreement for climate change. They are no longer working with the SDGs. They publicly declared that they're disavowing the SDGs and many other things. Development assistance is, of course, going down. I mean, so many changes from Donald Trump. And it is also not Donald Trump alone. That's also very important. It's not one person where you can say, okay, in a few years he's gone and then the world is a better place. It's a larger movement. It's a larger movement of populist, anti-environmental, anti-international, anti-globalist, whatever, anti-movements that are taking 10, 20, 30% of the votes in many of our countries. And that is a challenge for those who are caring for climate and for democracy and for the Earth system. And so I'm doing actually for the last 5 months quite a bit of scratching of my head. What actually does it mean for my field, political science, international relations, Earth system governance, global governance? For me, I mean, my understanding is, I mean, I sometimes like to say it's the end of the long 1990s. So we have an epochal change, actually. And end of the 1990s, I mean, starting with the breakdown of the Berlin Wall in 89, which actually is very important for me because I was actually there at that time. I was in West Berlin, very exciting moment in many ways. And then 1992 was from our community here, climate and Earth system, Planetary, was the Rio conference, this huge kind of enthusiastic moment in a way where the climate convention was agreed, the biodiversity convention was agreed, Agenda 21 and other things were all. It was kind of a moment that you would not expect anymore to happen in our lifetime right now, this moment. And this has ended. And this means also that the 1990s are over in a sense, and we're entering a new phase and planetary development in Earth system governance in a way where we have to understand, number one, this old idea about universal order is, at least temporarily, put it this way, coming to an end. Universal order, the idea is we are all together. We do this with 190 countries. We have a big agreement, we have the United Nations, we have a consensus principle, and then everybody will be happy, and we have a fantastic international world constitution that some people are still talking about. That's not happening right now. Universal order is open. These old ideas of linear progress, which is implicitly a typical 1990s idea, it gets better. I mean, nothing is perfect. They have another COP, then we have one more COP, then we have another declaration, and then we have some decisions and some policy process, and every policy process will somehow linear getting better and advancing. That's also not necessarily, so we can also entertain the hypothesis it goes backwards. Maybe, I don't know. That's kind of, I mean, not that I want, but it's kind of also, we have to get out of this. And of course, the stable country blocks, that's also coming to an end. I mean, the stable ideas that we have, especially the transatlantic alliance based on common values, I mean, that is probably at least temporarily over, and we have to find solutions. And what I think what's important is for those countries that are interested in climate and democracy, the topic of the series, is to really focus more on ideas of plurilateral institutions. Plurilateralism means not everybody is there. It means many countries or many actors are working together, but not necessarily everybody. So you need coalitions of the willing, clubs working together. It's not new per se. I mean, this idea has been around. Plurilateralism actually comes, to some extent, plurilateral institutions comes from the World Trade regime, where you had plurilateral agreements. But now I think it's no longer an exception. It will become the new normal, the new rule. And also, a lot of literature about climate clubs and smaller agreements on climate change were always implicitly, not explicitly, but implicitly based on the idea that the United States would lead. So you would say there are a few countries, America would lead. Or a few countries would do something, America would be at least part of it. And now we have to have a discussion, how can we build plurilateral institutions without the United States of America? And not necessarily only without, maybe even opposing, objecting, working against it, as they do with the International Criminal Court. So these are kind of the new situations we have. And for me as a researcher, I mean, this is one of the areas I want to spend some time in the future trying to more systematically understand how plurilateralism actually works. There is empirical examples from the past, but more systematically looking at this, I think is a fantastic area for doing more research. And the same is the case for the United Nations per se. We are also, I mean, I always like to use this black and white photos to really show the UN is old. I mean, it has been created in 1948. It's as old as my mother in a sense. So it's really an old organization and hasn't changed much since then. It is kind of very much based on principles of the 1940s, and one could say even of the 19th century. So many people say it has to be changed, changing the Charter, the United Nations 2.0, etc. But that is also not really happening right now. So therefore, we also have to think about how can we work in the UN system in a plurilateral way towards a layered UN where we defend the UN as an overall framework. So I'm not against the UN. I don't want to break it down, of course, no? But also finding ways how we are not going for the big constitutional change, but trying to find ways in small groups of countries trying to advance progressive agendas on climate and democracy and other issues in the UN setting. And that can be done, for example, there's this paragraph, the Article 22 of the UN Charter, for example, is a possibility for the General Assembly of the United Nations just to agree by majority vote on new bodies. I mean, this is kind of subsidiary organs. I mean, it's not only, but in a sense, the General Assembly could just say, we want to have a world parliament, whatever, that kind of talking, just putting something out. And that can be done with majority vote. You don't have to wait for the opinion and the bursting blood vessels of Donald Trump. I mean, that's kind of not necessary. You can just do it by majority vote. You need 100 countries, case closed. I mean, it's not effective, it's not ideal. I would like to have it differently, but in just practical terms, it could be one way forward. And for example, I mean, just very concretely, Brazil came up with the idea that I just pointed out, in a sense. It said the United Nations should have a climate change council within the UN. I mean, this is a new Brazilian proposal. They are leading the next COP. They want to kind of on climate change, and they want to bring this proposal in. It's a huge discussion. So I was in a workshop, two workshops already on this particular topic. It's not 100% clear what Brazil wants. I mean, that's another question, of course, and nobody knows. I mean, I don't know in a sense, but this is an interesting idea. I mean, I would have some questions there. So if you want to have this climate change council, would you have it outside the UN or inside the UN? I mean, there are different options there. What would be the relationship to the Climate Convention, which is also a normative body? What would be the membership of the Climate Change Council? Will it be a typical UN, like 50 countries, geographically diverse? Or would you have a different type of membership, different type of decision making? So there are lots of options out there. I mean, I have one concern in the sense that I think climate is only one issue. We have more other issues. I think what's much more needed is a council at UN level which brings together all the different planetary concerns, like the planetary boundaries. So it's not only climate, it's also biodiversity, oceans, and many others, land, water, whatever it is. And I think it's much more useful to bring that together in the UN level, and then think about something like a planetary protection council, whatever this might be, could be more useful. I'm very happy to get into discussion and think about what this could mean together. It's kind of thing. Generally, I think these are fantastic areas for research. So if anybody is in this space, interested in these issues, I think these are very important questions, very timely also, because Brazil has taken initiative. They went out, they said, we want to have this, and now everybody can support it, criticize it. I mean, maybe there's some momentum for something new, and that is theoretically an idea that can be advanced by Article 22 of the UN. The General Assembly can just decide on it. Case closed. And the Americans can't do anything, or anybody else who works with the Americans on these levels. Then the justice, I mentioned already, the slide you have seen, I just repeated in a sense, is of course another very, very complex issue for planetary politics, in a sense, in Earth system governance. And one thing that is very fundamentally disturbing is, of course, that most UN agencies are likely to lose 20 to 30% of the income, which is, I mean, depending on where you are and depending on how the politics are happening, but there will be massive cuts in UN funding. In humanitarian aid, that seems to be the biggest thing. United Nations Environment Program, some people say will be not that tough because it's not that depending on US money in the first place. But other, I mean, whatever, I don't have the numbers, it's also not yet known, but it will be huge. It will be the biggest downsizing of the international organizations in the last 80 years, I guess, whatever, I don't know. That's kind of, it's a huge change, and people have not really realized what it means for all the functions that all these various international organizations UN have. And we have to think about what else to do. I mean, the one thing is just to call for more money, but it's not really coming. You can't go to the government of Sweden and say, can you pick this up, please? So it's not happening. So I think what I would find personally interesting, not the only solution, it's not the silver bullet, but think about more alternative funding mechanisms. I mean, there are these ideas out there for having levies or taxation for air transportation, for tickets, for shipping. I mean, there are quite a few of these ideas out there, and I think it's a time to really investigate this in much more detail and get into this direction. And now I come to the fourth part of my talk. I have still some time. No? Good, okay. And now just for the organizers, I have an extra block on democracy. I'm not a democracy expert, but I have a little bit also some considerations about democracy, which is of course extremely important. I will focus on global democracy. We just had a discussion also that you are, I mean, those of you who are working with Mikhail and others, I mean, that you also work on climate litigation, which I think fascinating. Had I known this before, I would also put some slides there, very important. And this idea about long-termism and national constitutions that some of you are working on, I find this also very important. And not a slide, but I support this very much. I think it's a fantastic idea. So I'm talking a bit more on the global level in line of the rest of my talk. which is not the only area where democracy is, of course, important. Number one, I think one issue is, of course, that the UN is working on the one country, one vote principle. I mean, it's what's called several equality, which some countries would perceive as being unfair, meaning that every country has one vote regardless of the size. And that is what some people call planetary governance by micronations. I mean, that you have the proud nations of Monaco, Andorra, Luxembourg, and Liechtenstein. They all have the same vote as China, India, Indonesia, United States, and others. I mean, that is not very effective in a way. When you have many of these UN agencies also work with consensus. I mean, so if one of these many 190 countries is objecting, that's what in climate change is the case. I mean, climate convention works with consensus, and that's not the most effective way to run an international decision-making procedure. There are some people, and this may be also a question for a democracy program. I mean, some people argue then, well, then do it by world population, but that is first totally unrealistic, and second leads also to results where only 7 countries have the majority. I mean, that's kind of, you can see it here: China, India, US, Indonesia, Brazil, Pakistan, Nigeria maybe. Then you have already the majority, and this is not a very doable, realistic proposition either. It sounds kind of very democratic, sounds interesting, but it's not how the world is moving forward. One thing what we developed in the Earth System Governance Project, I mean, normally the Earth System Governance Project has no policy positions as such, but I mean, in this case, 30 authors of our community got together some years ago and wrote an article about more the political conclusions. So one idea we had in this community, I mean, you see the authors there, there are also some from Stockholm. Carl Volker was there, I'm sure, yeah. Anyway, some others. The idea would be that you have a UN Council on Sustainable Development, we had at that time, but could be also for others, where you give a special voting rights to the G20. And the G20 would be a proxy for big countries. It's not an ideal proxy because the current G20 are defined by economic power, and not necessarily 100% consistently so. And you might want to have a preference for big countries, large population-wise. I mean, so not economic, but population size. So these are kind of proxies, but the idea is you have a council in which big countries, however you want to define them, have a permanent seat and maybe also special voting rights to kind of get a bit more balance between the size of a country in terms of population, relevance of the country, and at the same time to have somehow this UN process where countries are still voting. So this is kind of one idea for the more traditional intergovernmental system, to make these 19th century voting procedures in the UN a little bit more realistic and therefore also more effective. The other discussion is, of course, to have a democratization outside the intergovernmental decision-making process. And there are essentially, from the democracy perspective, these 3 different approaches. There is a large community, a movement out there to have a UN parliamentarian assembly, like a world parliament. Could be done in different ways. You could have parliamentarians being sent to this. I mean, like that a Swedish parliament, a member of the Swedish parliament from here would be kind of brought to New York for a year or a month or whatever it is, and kind of that would be one model. Then you have the idea of bringing civil society forward, I mean, up to the point of having maybe a civil society forum as a chamber in the UN system. And then you have, of course, citizens' assemblies, and understand this is already a very strong line of research in your community here. One point I have, and this is especially for the parliamentarian assembly, is again the current trends of increasing, I mean, democracy is a bit on going backwards, if I may say so, in a way. So, I mean, many of these ideas are built on a multi-level model of democracy, meaning you have democracy and parliaments and civil society at the national level, and then you have it at the global level. But what do you do if nobody has, if there are very few democratic countries left, in a sense, if the majority of the countries at the national level is not democratic anymore? I mean, then it's also difficult to have a parliamentarian assembly with national parliamentarians. It might be a very small parliament at some point. Perfect. So that the global civil society organization, that's one proposal I mentioned already. It's not happening. This was an idea also in the 1990s to have a global forum of civil society with lots of civil society organizations. The proxy to that in the current system is what is known as the major groups. I don't know how many of you have been in UN settings in a sense. So there is a meeting of the UN, and in the end there are civil society speakers, spokesperson, who are then representing the major groups of civil society. So there's a major group of indigenous people, the major group of science, the major group of women and children and youth and everything. And that is kind of the representation that we have in the current system. And that's, on the one hand, it's good, it adds voices. It's also, from political science perspective, not that easy in a way. So we did some studies, because I found this very interesting, the representation mechanism there. We did one study with a colleague, Carol on Senate, where we looked at, we got a lot of data actually from the UN. We looked at the negotiation process of the SDGs, where we looked at the origin of speakers. And we had 238 representatives who spoke on behalf of the world's civil society. And then if you look at where they come from, that 73% of all those are from the OECD. And actually, and that was quite surprising, I checked it actually yesterday because I wanted to be very sure, 30% are actually originally from the United States of America. They're Americans. So they're not immigrants into America, which you also quite often have in New York, where people staying for a long time and get an American passport. Apparently, these are really people who give in the survey, they said, I come from the United States. So you have a huge dominance of OECD people speaking on behalf of all kind of interests, which is not necessarily, they're all good friends, I guess, and they do fantastic work. But I mean, from the democratic theory perspective, you might want to have a doubt about that particular thing. And then it's also, I can't talk about it, but we have also written a paper about all the procedural misrepresentation that's happening. So if a person is there and reads out a statement, let's say on behalf of science and technology, major group science and technology, and the question is, how is actually the thing being written? I mean, where does it come from? I mean, who has kind of decided on this paper? And there are lots of barriers that, again, in the end are leading, and this was also the title of this paper, to a marginalization of the global south. It's very much an OECD process by numbers, but also by processes. We did the similar studies, but it's a bit different on science. So we wanted to know to what extent is actually the global south marginalized in global science. And that's also like we're just counting. That's what we like to do sometimes at Utrecht. I mean, together with our team in a way. So we looked at the Global Sustainable Development Report. It's a huge UN report, very prestigious, has been coming from the UN Secretariat. We looked at the references. We counted all the references. All the references were counted. And we looked at where are actually all these references coming from and who has published them. There was only 1% of the references were by authors who come from the least developed countries. 87% of the references are from author teams based in OECD countries. So essentially, even the top UN reports reflecting North OECD-based science. The same, we looked at international research conferences, where only like 10 to 20% of participants are from the global south. We looked at journals, who is publishing all the top journals. We looked actually, I mean, we're also self-critical. We included Earth System Governance, our own journal, in the set. We are not doing much better than the others. We tried maybe hard. Global Sustainability, which is the Future Earthlight journal, is also in the set. So essentially, I mean, the authorship from global south is around like 9 to 17%. So it's it's a science which is very much based, and this comes back, of course, when you think about the role of science in decision making. I mean, then you always have to see, I mean, where is the science actually coming from? Are there any interests, any perceptions, any framings, any visions coming with the science when it enters, especially the social science, when it enters international debates? So the Citizen Assembly, I put the slide in for you guys in a sense. I think it's actually an interesting idea, this idea to have citizen assemblies locally, but also at the global level. There's a proposal out there to have a citizen assembly in the UN system, also under Article 22 could be done in a sense, so that there would be like a chamber in the UN. I think it's tremendously complicated. I have also lots of doubts about it and questions about it, but generally I think it could be an interesting debate also for your research here to pursue this further. I think that certainly, and it takes away some of these biases that I was mentioned. I mean, maybe it brings other biases, but I think it could make it a little bit more legitimate and a little bit more balanced, especially on the global north, global south front on this line. So I think that could be an interesting debate to move forward. And I would be happy maybe also to be involved in these kind of things. A last point on democracy, that is also one hobby I had at one point, is for long-term democracy. Long-term democracy, one thing is, of course, changing constitutions, changing national institutions, having a council on future generations and these kind of things. Another one is that there are certain issues where we really need to have long-term institutions. For example, some people are proposing carbon dioxide removal as an additional complementary action for climate change. This only works when the carbon is governed forever. So you have to kind of put it under the ground forever. And for that, you need long-term institutions. And that is kind of the requirement. How do you build up an institution that is functioning for hundreds of years? And I did one paper with a colleague in Germany, which I found really interesting. I mean, I did only one paper, it's not my research line, about long-term institutions. We looked at institutions that have been around for 1,000 years. I mean, of many, many years. So we really, there was kind of a selection on the dependent variable, so to speak, in a sense. So I mean, there's an insurance in Germany for hundreds of years, and we found a Japanese company that has been around for 1,500 years in business. Now they went bankrupt because of neoliberal globalization, but they have been in place for 1,500 years as a functioning company. Then, of course, you have the Catholic Church is also around for 2,000 years, stable leadership transition, not always non-violent, but normally it works in a sense. Anyway, Japanese emperor, also more than 2,000 years. And here, I mean, the point is, and that's important for democracy, none of these organizations are democratic. All the leadership transition is based on family or on being man, or being on all kind of strange criteria that you don't want to have for long-term Earth system governance. That's kind of one of the downsides. So what we need to find out how we can really have long-term institutions that go for generations in a stable way. And that's a new research question. So these are not good examples, not recommended. Nothing against the Catholic Church. But anyway, that's kind of not the way forward. And now I come to the last part of my talk. And that's an example. And that's kind of an example where everything comes together. I mean, whatever I have said so far, it comes together and unites it. I mentioned for that reason, but the second reason is also that I find this a very important debate, which is about whether we should geoengineer our way out of the climate problem. And that is a big debate that is emerging in the climate community. Some people really consider, and they say that we're not making the 1.5 degrees, we will not make anything, and therefore we have to explore now technologies for solar geoengineering. And that would be, in that case, the idea is to block a part of the sunlight by artificial means. You can have mirrors in outer space. It's more one of the crazy ideas, but much more realistic, and is also now being pushed by the British government to some extent, would be to have airplanes or balloons or drones or something like that that would inject particles into the stratosphere. And then you would kind of have an effect that parts of the sunlight would be blocked and would be slightly cooler on Earth. Technically, I mean, there's lots of things to be said about risk, about the possibilities of scientists to really think this through and understand the Earth system, because the results you only know when you have done it on the planetary scale. But I want to mention here especially the democracy part. I mean, how would you govern this? How would you govern a process by which scientists are, governments in a sense, are running a geoengineering scheme that you would need to run for several hundred years in a way that everybody is kind of happy and democratically. And that is one of the big challenges. And I say that many of the natural scientists who are pushing this, they're assuming what I call the Captain Kirk. I mean, they believe in the papers, they say, we will do, and we will do means there is kind of somebody like the benevolent, rational, impartial, fully informed governor for our planet, like the Earth's governor. And this is kind of Captain Kirk, white male American, kind of, whatever, taking levers. And this, of course, Captain Kirk doesn't exist. No? It's instead, we are dealing with United Nations. It's not really functioning in any way. Fragmented, anarchic competition. So this is not democratically really governed. It's a big problem. So you have UN institutions, but none of them has been created and will function for a geoengineering scheme. I mean, that's very, very sure. And if nothing works, I mean, then you will have unilateral geoengineering. So if you would argue that global governance is not available, it will not functioning, it won't be democratic, and some actors might go for it, then you might have these kind of folks doing it together in some kind of very strange combinations with private actors and big powers, etc. So for that reason, And that is the last part, in a sense, slightly actual. I have taken, it's also part of science in a sense, so I'm taking a very outspoken position on that. And I worked with colleagues where we really wrote an open letter, where we say what we need to have is an international non-use agreement on solar geoengineering. And that's also important to mention in a sense. So this is really, it's based on science, but it's really also where scientists are speaking out. So we have written this letter. Bill Gates doesn't like it, so Bill Gates wants it, but these experts want to stop it, and because Bill Gates gives some money for geoengineering research. But essentially, we have brought together 560 signatories from 67 countries now, many IPCC authors, quite a few Swedes also involved. We have more than 2,000 signatories from civil society. And they're trying to call for a ban on the development of solar geoengineering technologies. I could talk much about it. I have a separate presentation on this. And we get also there is some movement. I mean, African countries have spoken out last year in Nairobi, and they have openly said they don't want to have it. I mean, African countries, even though you would suspect they might be in favor because, I mean, they are the most impacted by climate change, they said, we don't want you guys to kind of geoengineer your way out of your responsibility to fix the climate change problem by reducing your excessive emissions, in a sense. So Africa have really been spoken out. And if you want to know more, and I'm exactly on time, thank you so much. If you want to know more about it, we have a website, solargeoeng.org, where you can also sign if you want to. I mean, it's a signature there. You can just support this initiative. And also, if you are interested in Earth system governance, we have a full website. And also there you can join. I mean, you can just not sign, but you can become a research fellow. You can join as an organization. We have a conference this year in South Africa, next year in the UK, different places. And if you don't find anything, you can always ask me. It's also fine, and I can help you around. Thank you so much for your attention. Thanks a lot. It's a pleasure.